skills and the techniques that were used in bayonet combat during the day. So to roll into this, I wanted to start by just talking a little bit about bayonet fighting, when they fought, why they fought with bayonets, and so on and so forth. Pay no attention. Alright, so first and foremost, bayonet fighting. During the period of the American Revolution, they had muskets, they had guns, and they had bayonets that went on the end of the muskets and guns. So there was a reason that you still wanted to fight with a melee weapon even though you had guns. So I'd like to kind of go around, get to that, but it's going to be a huge circle to get back around to that, so bear with me. So thinking about combat, let's think about combat in the modern combat sense. The purpose of combat, the purpose an infantry platoon goes into combat, is not actually necessarily to kill the bad guys. It's actually to take control of a position, take control of soil. So in the modern day we have things, we have train depots, we have warehouses, we have hospitals. If you were at a war, you would think a hospital would be kind of a nice thing for you to have. But they didn't typically fight over a hospital because it's hard to treat patients if bullets are flying. So you actually fight over the access to these things. So roads, bridges, every good war movie has a bridge scene. There's a bridge in every good war movie, right? Because a bridge is an access point to things that you want to control. So if you are a modern day infantryman and you are going to go into combat to take control of a position, there's generally speaking, let's kind of bring it down to kind of a third grade educational standpoint, there's really three phases of the engagement that you're going to go through. The first phase is the preparation phase. So you're going to get together with your guys, you're going to say that's what we want to do, and you're going to go do it. The second phase is the movement and fire phase. So once you leave your cover and you enter into a position where you're exposed to enemy fire, you are now in the movement and fire phase. In this phase of the movie is where most of the battle scenes are. Guys are shooting, a guy shows up with a big light machine gun, drops on the ground, somebody yells, "Covering fire," and then he just sprays everything with bullets. The purpose of this is the enemy can now shoot at you, can now hurt you, but you physically need to get closer to them. The covering fire is creating a situation that has four very expensive words. You are trying to obtain and maintain temporary firepower superiority. So what that means is you are shooting so many bullets downrange that the enemy cannot shoot back at you. He is too afraid of getting shot himself to effectively shoot at you. Once you maintain temporary firepower superiority, you can then move across the battlefield. So this is what you typically think of in movies where guys are shooting back and forth and they're running up the battlefield. The hope of every infantryman is that this is the end of the battle, is that the enemy gets scared, they run away, you take the position, and then your objective is maintained. Because the last phase is the assault phase. This is the most dangerous phase of combat today. This is the phase that begins whenever you are physically close enough to the bridge, to the town center, to the building that you are trying to take. Now you have to physically go in and take the soil away from the enemy. This is where you see the gentlemen in the movies kick the doors open with machine guns and guns ablazing, throwing grenades in windows, some machine guns. This is also the part of the movie where the guy with the flamethrower shows up out of nowhere and starts toasting the bad guys. Those are the tools of the assault phase of the battle today. So bring it to the 18th century. So the 18th century warrior, he had shipping depots, he had warehouses that he wanted to take from the enemy, he had roads, they had bridges, they had the same objective. The difference is they didn't have the same tools. So in the planning and preparation phase, they didn't have walkie-talkies, they didn't have cell phones, they had to talk, they had to send runners, so they had to do things differently. But the same thing, once they found the enemy, once they decided to advance upon the enemy and engage them, they moved into the movement fire phase. They did not use the terms move and fire phase and assault phase. That's kind of my terms I'm using. Those are modern terms. But they still did the same thing. The way they maintained temporary fire superiority was with this. This was the musket. This was the high-powered, high-volume firepower superiority weapon of the day. They did the same thing. They utilized linear battle tactics. They utilized the musket. They maintained temporary fire superiority so that one group could advance while the other group was firing. And if I keep talking about that, I'm going to talk about it for 45 minutes. So let's just jump to the fact that now the 18th century warrior is close enough to that house, that building, that he has to physically take it from the enemy. The enemy will not retreat from the building. They have to go into the assault phase. They did not have flamethrowers in the 18th century. They did not have submachine guns. They did have grenades, but grenades were different back then. They were not really effective. So the tool of the 18th century warrior for the assault phase of a battle was 18 inches of cold steel. So every battle was ended with the bayonet. I should say every battle that ended in an assault was ended with the bayonet. So any warrior who went into combat with no bayonet could not enter an assault phase. And the Continental Army, or the American rebels, if you would like to call them that, were woefully unprepared for this. They were exceptionally good with their personal firearms, their squirrel rifles, their hunting weapons, at maintaining temporary firepower superiority, because they were good shots, they were well trained. But without the bayonet, when the British got close enough to physically take the soil from the American rebels, they could not withstand it. They could not stand against the bayonet. And if you imagine you kick down the door with your one-shot musket, and you shoot your musket and you miss, you're pretty much done. So there's no multi-fire weapons. The bayonet is the weapon of the 18th century warrior for physically taking the soil away from the enemy. The British caught on to this very quickly, especially early war. You would see instances in the Battle of New York, for instance, where the British light infantry were so confident in the bayonet that they would come onto the field and they would just skip the rest of the phases. They would just go into a dead charge all the way across the field while taking fire, and the American rebels would break because they knew psychologically, once those guys get here, we cannot beat them. So that is the topic of discussion today. In general, there are a couple principles with how to fight with the bayonet that I'm going to go over real quick. But that is the general overarching structure of 18th century combat and why the bayonet was important. This was the weapon that finished the fight in the American Revolution. So before I go into some ideas, some procedures on how to fight with the bayonet, do I have any questions about what I just talked about? Awesome. That either means I did a terrible job or I did a great job. So, there's a couple different principles that I want to talk about and that we want to show today. So the first is formation unity. So I mentioned earlier that they fought in a linear formation. Today's military does fight in a formation. If you pick up like manuals from a military surplus store, you'll see little X's and O's like a football team. That's a formation. They tell you where to stand and how to fight. But the formation is different than back then. So in modern military bayonet fighting, they teach you how to fight like it's a bar fight. Like you're fighting one guy on two, two on three, so on and so forth. That's due to the formation. Gentlemen, can I get two guys to stand on one side of me? So in the 18th century, the formation that won the war was this, the linear formation. Gentlemen, charge your bayonets. How's up? So in this position, if I try and do some crazy maneuvers, it's pretty much impossible because I'm surrounded by guys. So long story short, shoulder your firelocks. If you fought in formation, you won battles. Thank you, gentlemen. If you did not, you lost battles. So you had to fight within that formation with your bayonet. So this transcribed into what they called bayonet fencing. So everything had to be front and back, just like fencing. You paraded, you parried, so on and so forth in a fencing maneuver. So first, maintaining your formation was critical. The first man to the enemy was the first man to die. So you wanted to get there together. Second is what they would have called lines of force. So today we call this biomechanics. I don't know, could I get a volunteer? So, there we go, put the musket to the side real quick. So here's what I'd like to show. Put your hand up, and we're going to push against each other. 1, 2, 3, go. All right, that's good. So as you can see, we're both pushing in front of our bodies, and we cannot push each other over. If I want to try something else, I want to try like this. You push the same way I'm going to push back. 1, 2, 3, go. Yeah, there's nothing I can do. Your body is designed to have force in front of you. Thank you. So this is lines of force, as they would have called it. We would have called it biomechanics. It's math and it's science. Math and science wins wars. So first and foremost, whenever you parry the enemy's attack, you do not want to parry backwards. You want to parry forwards. So I'm trying to parry the enemy's attack in my greatest line of force. So that's the second principle that we'd like to show today. The gentlemen need to parry in front of their body to block the enemy weapon. Once again, this is fencing. You don't have to parry a lot. Just a couple inches is all that it takes for him to miss you. The second thing is the fort of your weapon. Sierra, could I ask you to come up and give me a hand again? So, once again, you can see we're, go ahead and go to the on guard. So let's put our bayonets together. So you try and push me down. I'm trying to push you down. We're both in our strongest positions. 1, 2, 3, go. Once again, that's good. We're pretty evenly matched. But I want to change something. Same thing. I'm going to put my weapon down here. 1, 2, 3, go. There, I was actually trying, if you don't believe it or not, but I have no way in order to overcome him because of math and science. So what he's doing is he's creating a lever between his arm and his shoulder. The power in his lever is right here at his hand. So the closer to his hand that he parries, the stronger he is. So there's just a 10-to-1 or 100-to-1 ratio from here to me. Now, if we came together, we would be equal. So the second principle is parrying with the fort of your weapon. The fort would be closest to the lever. So anywhere on the weapon, on the barrel of the weapon, close to your left hand. That is the second principle. The third principle is the lunge. So in this principle, once you parry the enemy's weapon, you're going to lunge into a thrust and, of course, finish off the enemy. Now, if you were to attack the enemy and throw your weapon and fall, you're pretty much done because there's another enemy there. So everything has to be controlled. So once you parry in your maximum force with your mechanical advantage with the fort of your weapon and lunge, you must maintain the center of your gravity so that you can retrieve and recoil and be ready for the next enemy to parade or so on and so forth. So in our competition specifically, what you guys are going to see, pay no attention, is the 4 gentlemen lining up, marching together as a formation. They will be judged on their unity throughout the whole process. They will be judged on their composure as they come, parry in the correct direction, flourish, which would mean an additional, more difficult parry. They get extra points if they knock the cup off, and then lunge while maintaining center of gravity so that they can come back. 1 point for the hay bale. We will have targets who have cards for an additional point for thrust accuracy. How'd I do, Blake? Is it 15 minutes? Perfect. Nobody wants to hear me talk for more than 15 minutes. So, with that, judges, would you like to start registering teams? And while they're doing the boring registering for teams part and practicing a couple times, do we have any questions from the audience? Anything I can ask or answer? Yes, ma'am? You
mentioned that the Americans weren't good at it in the beginning. How did they get good at it?
So, the first, I kind of oversimplified the topic, but the reason they weren't good at it in the beginning is because they didn't have bayonets. So, so whenever you have a civilian weapon, you know, you go to Rural King or any place you can buy a weapon today, most of them don't have a lug to attach a bayonet to. So in the 18th century, they didn't have that either. So first and foremost, they were underarmed because they could not attach a bayonet to their weapon anyway. The other thing is this is a socket bayonet, which was a new invention of the time, and you can see the bayonet goes over the barrel. So I can actually load and fire while my bayonet is fixed. The previous generation technology to this was a plug bayonet, which was a knife that you stuck in the barrel. So that was not as, you would actually have to take time to fix your bayonet, which in the middle of combat, when people are shooting at you, you don't have a lot of time. So the first part was they didn't have the technology. The second part was that they were not trained on how to do it because they were not a regular army that had officers who understand the principles And then once again, the technology. I mean, if your soldiers don't have a bayonet, there's no sense in spending the time training them to have a bayonet. As the war progressed, the Continental Army began to get better funded. They began to get weapons with bayonets. They began training to the bayonets to the point that even in 1779, a General Anthony Wayne made a comment that he did not like rifles and he would prefer that his men go into combat with bayonets and muskets and no ammunition than with rifles. So the idea of using bayonets in combat was important enough that even the American rebels knew it. Because of logistics and because of training, it took time until later in the war, and then specifically the last campaigns of the war where the Continental Army actually stood British bayonet charges. Sorry, that was way longer than it needed to be. Anything else? Nothing? How we doing, guys? Is everybody signed up?
We're working on it. We're trying to get a little more.